2 Maccabees, Chapter 1. Greetings to our brothers, the Jews in Egypt, from their brothers, the Jews in Jerusalem and in the region of Judea. May you have peace and happiness. May God fill you with every good and remember his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, his faithful servants. May he give you all a heart to worship him and to fulfill his will with generosity and a well-disposed spirit. May he incline your hearts to listen to his law and precepts and give you peace. May he hear your prayers and be reconciled with you and not abandon you in time of misfortune. This is what we now pray for you. In the year 179, when Demetrius was king, we Jews wrote to you during the most critical moment of trials that we had to endure during those years. And we said to you, Jason and his associates have betrayed the cause of the Holy Land and of the kingdom. They have burned the temple gateway and shed innocent blood. But we prayed to the Lord and were heard. And now we have just offered a sacrifice with wheat flour, lighted the lamps again, and set out the loaves of bread. So we write to you again that you may celebrate the Feast of Tents in the month of Kislev in this year 188. The inhabitants of Jerusalem and Judea, their senators and Judas, to Aristobulus, teacher of King Ptolemy, belonging to the family of the anointed priests, and to the Jews in Egypt, greetings and prosperity. Having been saved by God from great dangers, we give him thanks because he came to our help against the king himself. God drove out those who fought against the holy city. Their leader left for Persia with a seemingly invincible army, but the priests of the goddess Nanaya laid a trap for them and killed them in her temple. Antiochus and his friends came to that place under the pretext of marrying the goddess, but in reality they wanted to seize its great treasures as a dowry. The priests of Nanaya had set out the treasures, and Antiochus entered the sacred enclosure with a few men. But as soon as Antiochus had entered, they closed the temple and opened a secret door in the ceiling. Then they threw stones down and crushed the leader and his men. They then dismembered the bodies, cut off their heads, and threw them to those outside. In all these things, may our God be blessed, for he has handed over the impious to death. As we are about to celebrate the purification of the temple on the 25th day of Kislev, it seems good to us to inform you, so that you too may celebrate the Feast of Tents and remember the fire that appeared when Nehemiah, who built the temple and the altar, offered sacrifices. For when our ancestors were deported to Persia, the devout priests of the time took some of the fire from the altar and hid it secretly in the hollow of a dry well, with such caution that the place remained unknown to everyone. Many years had passed when in God's own time, Nehemiah, who was commissioned by the king of Persia, sent the descendants of the priests who had hidden the fire to look for it. But they reported to us that they did not find the fire, but instead a thick liquid. So Nehemiah ordered them to draw it out and bring it to him. When the sacrifice had been prepared on the altar, Nehemiah ordered the priests to sprinkle the liquid on the wood and the victims placed on it. They did so, and after some time, the sun, which had previously been clouded over, shone. At once, such a great fire blazed up that all were astonished. While the sacrifice was being consumed, the priests, together with all house present, prayed. Jonathan led, while Nehemiah and the rest responded. This was their prayer: Lord, Lord God, Creator of all things, dreadful and strong, just and merciful, you alone are good and are King. You alone are generous, just, all-powerful and eternal. You who save Israel from many evils, who chose our ancestors and sanctified them, accept this sacrifice on behalf of all your people Israel. Protect your heritage and sanctify it. Gather our scattered people together. Set free those held in slavery among the nations. Turn your eyes on those who are despised and crushed, so the pagans may know that you are our God. Afflict those who oppress us, who insult and treat us with contempt. Plant your people in your holy place, as Moses said. The priests sang the hymns, and when the sacrifice was all consumed, Nehemiah ordered that the remaining liquid be poured over some large stones. This was done, and a flame flared up, but it was outshone by the fire from the altar. This matter became known, and it was reported to the king of the Persians that the liquid with which Nehemiah and his companions had burned the sacrifice was found in the place where the exiled priests had hidden the fire. So, after verifying the facts, the king ordered that a fence be built to enclose the place and decreed that it be a sacred place. The king gave some of that liquid to those who enjoyed his favor, and they gave him gifts in return. Nehemiah and his companions called the place Nephtar, which means purification, but afterwards many called it Naphtah. 2 Maccabees, chapter 2. It is found in the archives that the prophet Jeremiah ordered the exiles to take the fire, as we have already said. After giving them the law, he exhorted them not to forget the precepts of God and not to let themselves be dazzled by the idols of silver and gold with all their adornment. He spoke to them of many similar things, admonishing them never to lose their love for the law. It is also said in these writings of the past that the prophet Jeremiah, fulfilling orders from heaven, commanded that the ark of the covenant with its tent be brought with him. And he went to the mountain which Moses had climbed before, and from where he had seen the promised land. There Jeremiah found a cave, and he brought in the ark, the tent that covered it, and the altar of incense. Then he closed up the entrance with stones. Some of those who followed him returned to mark out the way, but they could not find it anymore. When Jeremiah learned this, he reproached them and said, "This place is to remain hidden until God has compassion on his scattered people and gathers them together. Then the Lord will reveal these things again and his glory shall appear in the cloud, as it appeared in the time of Moses, and when Solomon asked God to come and consecrate his house. It was also reported in these archives how Solomon, inspired by his wisdom, offered the sacrifice of the dedication and completion of the temple. And as fire had come down from heaven through the prayer of Moses to consume the offerings and the sacrificial victim, so through the prayer of Solomon, fire also came down from heaven and burned up the holocaust. And what Moses had said was fulfilled. Inasmuch as the sin offering was not eaten, the fire consumed it. Solomon celebrated the feast too for 8 days. This also can be read in the archives and in the memories of Nehemiah's time. It is recounted there that Nehemiah founded a library and collected the books dealing with the kings and the prophets, the writings of David, and the letters of the kings about offerings. In the same way, Judas has just gathered all the books dispersed on account of the war we suffered, and they are now in our possession. So, if you need any of them, send someone to get them for you. We said we are now about to celebrate the feast of the purification of the temple. You will do well to celebrate these feast days also, for God has saved all His people and returned to everyone his own land. He let us recover the kingdom, the temple, and the worship rendered to Him in the temple, as is commanded in His law. God Himself, as we do hope, will soon have mercy on us and gather us together from everywhere to the holy place, since He has rescued us from great evils and has purified this place. The story of Judas Maccabeus and his brothers has been written by Jason of Cyrene. He narrated the purification of the temple of the Most High, the dedication of the altar, the wars against Antiochus Epiphanes and his son Eupator, and the heavenly manifestations in favor of those who fought bravely and gloriously for Judaism. Although they were few in number, they liberated the whole land and put to flight hordes of foreigners. They regained the temple, renowned throughout the world, liberated the city, and established the laws which were nearly abolished, for the Lord was gracious to them in His great kindness. All this, which has been set forth in 5 volumes by Jason of Cyrene, we shall now attempt to sum up in a single book. We recognize that these books contain many figures, and that it is difficult for those who wish to understand this history because of so many facts. So we have concerned ourselves to offer something engaging for those who simply want to read, something easily committed to memory and profitable for anyone who reads it. For us who have undertaken the arduous task of summarizing, it has not been easy, but has cost as much effort as it would to prepare a banquet which would please everyone. But like those who prepare a banquet, we have endured this toil willingly in order to please others. So we leave to the historian the task of relating accurately all the details, and we have condensed this enormous work into a simple summary. For just as the architect of a new house has to be concerned about the whole construction, while the painters and decorators are concerned only about what relates to their task, so it is with us. the analysis of details and discussion on disputable points belongs to the historian. But for one who tries to condense a report, his task is to summarize and not present a complete narration of facts and events. So let us begin our narrative without going on at length about what has been said before, for it would be senseless to expand the preface while cutting short the narration of the history itself. Second Maccabees, chapter 3. While the holy city enjoyed complete peace and the laws were observed as perfectly as possible through the piety of Onias the high priest and his hatred for all wickedness, it came about that kings honored the holy place and made the high priest richer by their magnificent gifts. Even Seleucus, king of Asia, paid from his own account for the expenses of the sacrificial services. But a certain Simon, a priest of the tribe of Bilgah and the temple administrator, came into conflict with the high priest regarding the inspection of the city markets. But he could not prevail over Onias. So he went to Apollonius of Tarsus, the governor of Chel, Syria and Phoenicia, and reported to him that the treasury in Jerusalem was full of untold wealth, that there was a great amount of money which had nothing to do with the expenses required by the sacrifices, and that all these could easily be brought under the control of the king. Apollonius met with the king and told him about the wealth that had been disclosed to him. The king then sent Heliodorus, who was in charge of his affairs, with a letter that authorized him to transfer the treasures. Heliodorus at once set out on his journey, pretending that he was going to visit Coel, Syria and Phoenicia, but with the intention of carrying out the king's order. On his arrival in Jerusalem, he was hospitably received by the city and the high priest, to whom he related the report that had been made. He revealed the reason for his coming and asked the high priest if the report was really true. The high priest explained that there were some deposits belonging to widows and orphans. Some belonged to Hyrcanus, son of Tobias, a person of very prominent position, who had also been affected by these slanders. All in all, the treasury had 400 talents of silver and 200 of gold. Finally, Onias pointed out that it was utterly impossible to cheat those who had put their confidence in this holy place and in the inviolable majesty of the temple venerated throughout the world. But, following the orders of the king, Heliodorus insisted that all those treasures should be turned over to the king. So, on the day set for Heliodorus to draw up the inventory, there was great disturbance in the city. The priests in their sacred vestments stood before the altar and called upon heaven. He who had given the law governing deposits should now preserve them for those who had deposited them. None could look at the face of the high priest without being deeply touched, for his appearance and his paleness revealed the anguish of his soul. A kind of fear overwhelmed him that made him tremble from head to foot, showing to those who saw him the sorrow of his heart. People rushed out of their houses in great confusion to pray together because the holy place was about to be profaned. The women, girded with sackcloth below their breasts, thronged into the streets. The younger girls, who were not yet allowed to go out into the streets, ran to the doorways, and some climbed the walls and others looked out from the windows. All raised their hands to heaven and joined in prayer. It was touching to see such a crowd prostrate in disarray on the ground, and the high priest in great anguish. While they were praying to the all-powerful Lord to protect the deposits of the temple and keep them safe for those who entrusted them to the high priest, Heliodorus began to carry out what had been decided upon. He had already come near the treasury with his bodyguard when the Lord of the spirits and of every power caused so great a manifestation that all who had dared accompany Heliodorus were astonished before the power of God, and they lost their strength and courage. There appeared to them a horse with magnificent gear, and on it was a fearsome rider. It rushed furiously at Heliodorus and struck at him with its forefeet. The rider appeared to have armor of gold, and two young men, strong and very beautiful and magnificently clothed, also appeared. They stood on each side of Heliodorus and flogged him continuously, inflicting stroke after stroke. Heliodorus fell to the ground, enveloped in great darkness. Then his men took him up and put him on a stretcher. So he was carried away, powerless even to help himself, he who but a moment before had proudly entered the treasury with a great retinue and all his bodyguard. Everyone clearly recognized the power of God. Because of the divine intervention, Heliodorus became mute and lost all hope of saving his life. Meanwhile, the Jews blessed the Lord who had glorified his holy place. The temple, which a little while before had been filled with terror and fear, now overflowed with joy and gladness because of the extraordinary manifestation of God. Then some of Heliodorus' companions begged Onias to call upon the Most High to grant the grace of life to him who was at the point of death. The high priest, on his part, feared that the king might suspect the Jews of some foul play against Heliodorus, so he offered a sacrifice for the man's recovery. While the high priest was offering the sacrifice of atonement, the same young men, clothed in the same way, again appeared to Heliodorus, and standing before him said, "Thank Onias the high priest, for through him the Lord grants you the grace of life. And as for you, who have been scourged by heaven's command, make known to all how great is the power of God." Having said this, they vanished. Heliodorus then offered a sacrifice to the Lord and prayed at great length to him who had spared his life. He took leave of Onias and went back with his guards to the king. There he began to bear witness to the works of the Most High God, which he had seen with his own eyes. The king asked Heliodorus who could be sent again to Jerusalem to carry out what he failed to do. Heliodorus answered him, "If you have some enemy whom you wish to eliminate, send him there, and you will see him return well flogged, that is, if he ever returns at all. For surely divine power is in that place. He himself who dwells in heaven watches over the place and defends it, striking to death those who come to profane it. This was what happened to Heliodorus, and how the treasury was saved. Second Maccabees, chapter 4. The Simon mentioned before as the informer about the treasures of the temple, who was traitor to his country, spoke evil of Onias, accusing him of a plot against Heliodorus and saying that he was responsible for all the troubles. He even dared to lay the blame for everything on Onias, who was the great benefactor of the city, the defender of his compatriots, and a zealous observer of the laws. The hostility between them reached such proportions that crimes were even committed by some of the supporters of Simon. Onias recognized the dangers involved in such an unbearable rivalry. Even Apollonius, son of Menestheus, governor of Celesyria and Phoenicia, was instigating Simon to evil. So Onias went to the king, not to accuse his fellow citizens, but for the good of the whole nation. For he saw that it was impossible to maintain peace and stop the foolishness of Simon without the king's intervention. When King Seleucus died, his son Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, succeeded to the throne. Then Jason, the brother of Onias the high priest, usurped the office of high priest. In a conversation with the king, Jason promised 360 talents of silver and 80 talents from other revenues. He further committed himself to pay 150 more talents if he would be allowed to establish on his own account a gymnasium with a center for the cultural advancement of the youth, and if the statute of Antiochian citizenship could apply to the inhabitants of Jerusalem as well. With the consent of the king and using the power at his disposal, he at once set about encouraging his fellow citizens to adopt the customs of the Greeks. He suppressed the privileges that kings had granted to the Jews through John, the father of Eupolemus, who had established friendship and an alliance between the Romans and the Jews. He overthrew lawful institutions and introduced new customs contrary to the law. So, he very readily founded a gymnasium right under the citadel and persuaded the noblest among the young to be educated in the Greek way. Paganism was propagated through Jason's influence, who proved to be more of a godless wretch than a high priest. Greek customs were so much in vogue that priests no longer showed any interest in serving at the altar. They despised the sanctuary and neglected the sacrifices, and as soon as the discus throw began, they would run to the stadium to take part in athletic competitions prohibited by the law. They did not value anymore the customs of their ancestors, but held in highest esteem the values of the Greeks. With this, they themselves were put in a difficult situation, for those whom they took as models and whose customs they wanted to imitate in everything proved to be their enemies and tyrants. For it is not easy to break the divine laws with impunity as the following episodes will show. When the quinquennial games held every 5 years were going on in Tyre for the king, the wicked Jason sent as envoys some citizens of Antioch from the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and he entrusted to them 300 drachmas of silver allotted for the sacrifice to Hercules. When these envoys came, they decided that it was not fitting to spend the money on the sacrifice, but preferred to spend it on other things. So, through the sole initiative of those sent to spend the money for the sacrifice to Hercules, the amount was used instead for the construction of trireme ships. Antiochus had sent Apollonius, son of Menestheus, to Egypt to represent him in the enthronement of King Philometor. But when Antiochus learned that Philometor had become his political adversary, Antiochus was worried about his own safety. So he left Joppa and went to Jerusalem, where he was well received by Jason and the whole city, entering the city in the midst of acclamations and torches. Then he went with his troops to Phoenicia. After 3 years, Jason sent Menelaus, brother of the Simon mentioned above, to bring the money to the king and initiate steps to negotiate urgent matters with him. Menelaus presented himself to the king, whom he impressed by his personal bearing as a man of authority, and so obtained the office of high priest for himself, offering 300 talents more than Jason. After receiving the royal mandate, he returned with nothing worthy of a high priest, but only with the rage of a cruel tyrant or a wild beast. Jason, who had usurped the office of his brother, was now supplanted by another and had to flee to the land of Ammon. Menelaus held the office, but did not pay the amount he promised to the king. Although Sostratus, the commander of the citadel, demanded the payment, since the king had entrusted to him the collection of revenue. The two of them were then summoned by the king because of this. Menelaus left his brother Lysimachus as his substitute, and Sostratus left Crates, the commander of the Cypriots. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of Tarsus and Mallus revolted because their cities were given as a gift to Antiochus, the king's concubine. The king set out at once to re-establish order, leaving Andronicus, one of his ministers, as his deputy. Menelaus thought of taking advantage of the opportunity and stole some of the golden vessels from the temple, which he then gave to Andronicus as gifts. He also managed to sell others in Tyre and in the neighboring cities. When Onias had clear evidence of what Menelaus had done, he sought refuge in Daphne near Antioch, a place of asylum, and from there denounced him. For this reason, Menelaus met Andronicus in private and urged him to kill Onias. Andronicus went to Onias and deceitfully gained his confidence, offering Onias his right hand in oath. He was able to persuade Onias, in spite of the latter's suspicion, to come out of his place of refuge. Then Andronicus killed him at once, without any regard for justice. For this reason, not only Jews, but people of other nationalities as well became indignant and grieved over the unjust killing of that man. When the king returned to the regions of Cilicia, the Jews of Jerusalem together with the Greeks who were for justice, went to see him and complained about the murder of Onias. The king was touched and became sad, and even wept as he remembered the personality and noble conduct of the departed. He became angry with Andronicus and immediately removed him from office. Then he ordered that Andronicus be divested of his purple robe, tore his garments off him, and led him all around the city up to the place where Andronicus had murdered Onias. And right there the king ordered that he be put to death, God dealing out to him the punishment he deserved. Lysimachus committed much sacrilegious plunder in Jerusalem with the connivance of Menelaus. When this became known, the populace rebelled against Lysimachus, who had already taken many golden vessels from the city. When Lysimachus saw the people rising up in rebellion and becoming enraged, he armed about 3,000 men and began a violent repression, designating as leader a certain Auranus, a man advanced in years but of very little intelligence. So the people were attacked by the men of Lysimachus. They reacted by picking up stones and clubs, and even gathered handfuls of ashes lying at hand, and threw everything against the men of Lysimachus. In this way, they wounded many of them, killed some, and put the rest to flight. As for the sacrilegious robber Lysimachus, they killed him near the treasury. Because of all this, a charge was brought against Menelaus, and when the king arrived at Tyre, 3 men sent by the council of the elders of Jerusalem told him of Menelaus' cruelty. Seeing his ruin, Menelaus promised a great amount of money to Ptolemy, son of Dorymenes, in order to have the king in his favor. Ptolemy then went with the king privately to a colonnade for some fresh air and persuaded him to change his mind. The king actually dismissed all the accusations against Menelaus, the cause of all this evil, while he condemned to death Menelaus' unfortunate accusers who would have been acquitted at a tribunal of barbarians judged them. So those who had defended the cause of the city, the people and the sacred vessels were executed at once. Some Tyrians were so enraged by that crime that they prepared a magnificent funeral for them. But through the corruption of the rulers, Menelaus remained in power, growing in wickedness and becoming a tyrant towards his own people. 2 Maccabees chapter 5. By this time, Antiochus was preparing a second expedition against Egypt, and for nearly 40 days there appeared throughout the city, galloping through the air, horsemen dressed in gold, troops with swords drawn and formed in squadrons, cavalry squadrons in order for battle, attacks and charges from this side and that, movements of shields, many spears, arrows, missiles, the glitter of golden outfits, and armor of all kinds. Everyone prayed that these apparitions would be an announcement of something good about to happen. As a false rumor spread that Antiochus had died, Jason gathered together about 10,000 men and launched a surprise attack on the city. The troops upon the walls defended the city, but once these were taken, the whole city fell into the hands of Jason, while Menelaus took refuge in the citadel. Jason cruelly massacred his fellow citizens without realizing that his victory against his own nation was the greatest defeat. He seemed to believe that he was winning over enemies, when in reality these were his own people. But he did not stay in power for long, and after obtaining nothing but shame for himself, he had to flee once again to the land of Ammon. Finally, he had a very unfortunate end. Accused before Aretas, the king of the Arabs, fleeing from city to city, pursued by all, scorned as a renegade from the law, and hated as the executioner of his country and fellow citizens, he was banished to Egypt. And he, who had exiled so many from their own country, died in exile. For he went as far as Lacedaemonia in the hope of finding protection there, because of the kinship between that people and ours. He, who had deprived so many of burial places, died with no one to mourn him, no funeral rites, nor place in the tomb of his fathers. When news of these events reached the king, he thought that the whole of Judea had risen in rebellion. He became furious, and leaving Egypt, went to take Jerusalem by force. He ordered his soldiers to kill without mercy everyone they encountered, and to behead as well all those who took refuge in their houses. Young and old perished, men, women, and children were massacred, and infants and virgins were put to the sword. Within only 3 days, there were 80,000 victims. 40,000 perished in the slaughter, and as many were sold as slaves. Not content with this, Antiochus boldly entered the holiest temple in the entire world, guided by Menelaus, the traitor to the law and country. With his unclean hands, Antiochus seized the sacred vessels, and with impious hands took away what other kings had given as gifts for the glory and honor of the temple. But in acting in such an insolent manner, Antiochus did not realize that the Lord had let him profane the temple in order to punish the inhabitants of the city, because their sins had offended him. For had the city not been sinful, Antiochus would have been flogged the moment he entered, as Heliodorus was sent by Seleucus to rob the treasury had been. And he would have also repented of his audacity. But God had not chosen the people for the temple, but the temple for the sake of the nation. Therefore, the temple also shared in the nation's misfortune, as it also shared afterward in its restoration. As it had been abandoned in the time of the wrath of God, it was again restored to its glory when the Most High Lord was appeased. Antiochus took with him 1,800 talents which he had stolen from the temple, and hurriedly went back to Antioch, so proud that he thought himself capable of sailing by land and walking on the sea. At his departure, he left ministers to oppress our race. In Jerusalem, he appointed Philip, of Phrygian ancestry and of more barbarous character than he who had appointed him. And he left Andronicus in Gerizim. Besides, there was Menelaus, who surpassed them in his hatred for his fellow citizens. This man had indeed a deep hatred for Jewish compatriots. Antiochus also sent Apollonius with an army of 22,000 soldiers, with orders to behead all the grown men and sell the women and children. arriving in Jerusalem under the pretext of peace, he waited until the holy day of the Sabbath. Then he took the Jews by surprise as they rested. He ordered his men to conduct a military parade, and he killed all those who came out to see the show. Then, running through the streets, the soldiers killed many people. Judas Maccabeus, however, withdrew into the desert, and about 9 others willing to live like the wild beasts. There they fed on clean vegetables, for they did not want to eat unclean meat. 2 Maccabees, chapter 6. After a while, the king sent an older Athenian to force the Jews to abandon their ancestral laws and no longer live according to the laws of God, and to have them also profane the temple in Jerusalem and dedicate it to the Olympian god. In the same way, he wanted them to dedicate the temple in Mount Gerizim to the hospitable god according to the wishes of the inhabitants of the place. This worsened the evil and made it difficult and unbearable for all. The temple was profaned by the orgies of the pagans who went there to have a good time with prostitutes and had intercourse in the sacred enclosures. And besides, they brought into the temple things not permitted by the law. The altar was laden with unclean victims prohibited by the law. It was no longer allowed to celebrate the Sabbath or observe the customs of our ancestors, or even to declare oneself a Jew. But on the contrary, they were led by bitter necessity to celebrate the king's birthday with a monthly sacrifice. And when the feast of Dionysus came, they were also forced to follow the Dionysus procession and wear floral wreaths. At the suggestion of the inhabitants of Ptolemy, a decree was sent to the neighboring Greek cities, ordering them to treat the Jews who lived there in the same way and oblige them to participate in the sacrifices. Those who would not adopt the Greek customs were to be killed. So it was easy to foresee the fatal outcome. 2 women were charged of having performed the rite of circumcision on their sons. They publicly paraded the women throughout the city with their babies hung at their breasts. Then they hurled them down from the city wall. Others who had assembled in nearby caves to celebrate the Sabbath were denounced to Philip, and they allowed themselves to be burned. Because of the holiness of the Sabbath day, they had scruples about defending themselves. I now ask the readers of this book not to be shocked by these calamities. Bear in mind that this did not happen for the destruction of our race, but rather for our education. God is showing His kindness when He does not let sinners continue on their way for a long time, but punishes them at once. As for the other nations, the patient Lord doesn't punish them until they reach the full measure of their sins. But He deals with us in a different manner. He does not wait until we have reached the full measure in order to punish us. Therefore, He never withdraws His mercy from us and does not abandon His people even when He punishes us with some adversity. After reminding our readers of these truths, let us continue the story. Eleazar, one of the prominent teachers of the law, already old and of noble appearance, was forced to open his mouth to eat the flesh of a pig. but he preferred to die honorably than to live in disgrace, and voluntarily came to the place where they beat him to death. He spit out bravely the piece of meat, as should be done by those who do not want to do things prohibited by the law, even to save their life. Those in charge of this impious banquet took him aside, since they had known him for a long time, and tried to convince him to pretend to be eating the meat, but in reality to eat something allowed by the law and prepared by himself. In this way he could escape death and be treated with humanity for the sake of their long-time friendship. But he preferred to make a noble decision worthy of his age, of his noble years, of his shining white hair, and of the irreproachable life he had led from childhood. Above all, showing respect for the holy laws established by God, he answered that he would rather be sent to the place of the dead. And he added, it would be unworthy to pretend at our age, and to lead many young people to suppose that I, at 90 years, had gone over to the pagan customs. If I led them astray for the sake of this short life, I would bring disgrace to my old age. Even if I could now be saved from mortals, I cannot, whether living or dead, escape from the hands of the Almighty. I prefer to bravely sacrifice my life now, as befits my old age. So I shall leave an excellent example to the young, dying voluntarily and valiantly for the sacred and holy laws. Having said this, he gave himself over to death. Those who escorted him considered his words foolishness, so their previous gentleness turned into harshness. When he was almost at the point of death, he said, groaning, "The Holy Lord, who sees all, knows that though I could have saved myself from death, I now endure terrible sufferings in my body, but in my soul I suffer gladly because of the respect I have for him. In his death, he left a noble example and a memorial of virtue and strength, not only to the young, but to the whole nation." Second Maccabees, chapter 7. It happened also that 7 brothers were arrested with their mother. The king had them scourged and flogged to force them to eat the flesh of a pig, which was prohibited by the law. One of them, speaking on behalf of all, said, "What do you want to find out from us? We are prepared to die right now, rather than break the law of our ancestors." The king became furious and ordered that pans and cauldrons be heated over a fire. When these were red hot, he commanded that the tongue of their spokesman be cut out, his head scalped, and his hands and feet cut off, while his brothers and mother looked on. When he had been thoroughly mutilated, the king ordered that while still breathing, he be brought to the fire and roasted alive. While the smoke from the pan spread widely, the other brothers and their mother encouraged one another to die bravely, and they said, "The Lord God sees all, and in reality has compassion on us, as Moses declared in his song, and clearly said, 'The Lord will have pity on his servants.'" When the first had left the world in this way, they brought the second for execution. After stripping the skin with the hair from his head, they asked him, "Which do you prefer, to eat the flesh of a pig or to be tortured limb by limb?" He answered them in the language of his ancestors, "I will not eat." And so he too was tortured. At the moment of his last breath, he said, "Murderer, you now dismiss us from life, but the King of the world will raise us up. He will give us eternal life, since we die for his loss." After this, they punished the third. He stuck his tongue out when asked to, bravely stretched forth his hands, and even had the courage to say, "I have received these limbs from God, but for love of his laws, I now consider them as nothing, for I hope to recover them from God." The king and his court were touched by the courage of this young man, so unconcerned about his own sufferings. When this one was dead, they subjected the fourth to the same torture. At the point of death, he cried out, "I would rather die at the hands of mortals and wait for the promises of God, who will raise us up. You, however, shall have no part in the resurrection of life." They took the fifth at once and tortured him. But with his eyes fixed on the king, he said to him, "Though you are mortal, you have authority over people and are able to do what you will. But do not think that our race has been abandoned by God. Wait, and you shall see his great power when he torments you and your descendants." After this, they took the sixth, who, at the point of death, said, "Don't be mistaken. We suffer all this because of ourselves, for we have sinned against our own God. So these astonishing things have come upon us. But do not think that you are going to remain unpunished after having made war with God." More than all of them, their mother ought to be admired and remembered. She saw her 7 sons die in a single day, but she endured it even with joy, for she had put her hope in the Lord. Full of a noble sense of honor, she encouraged each one of them in the language of their ancestors. Her woman's heart was moved by manly courage, so she told them, "I wonder how you were born of me. It was not I who gave you breath and life, nor I who ordered the matter for your body. The Creator of the world, who formed man in the beginning and ordered the unfolding of all creation, shall in his mercy give you back breath and life, since you now despise them for love of his laws." Antiochus thought that she was making fun of him and suspected that she had insulted him. As the youngest was still alive, the king tried to win him over not only with his words, but even promised to make him rich and happy if he would abandon the traditions of his ancestors. He would make him his friend and appoint him to a high position in the kingdom. But as the young man did not pay him any attention, the king ordered the mother to be brought in. He urged her to advise her son in order to save his life. After being asked twice by the king, she agreed to persuade her son. She bent over him and fooled the cruel tyrant by saying in her ancestral language, "My son, have pity on me." For 9 months I carried you in my womb and suckled you for 3 years. I raised you up and educated you until this day. I ask you now, my son, that when you see the heavens, the earth, and all that is in it, you know that God made all this from nothing, and the human race as well. Do not fear these executioners, but make yourself worthy of your brothers. Accept death, that you may again meet your brothers in the time of mercy. When she finished speaking, the young man said, What are you waiting for? I do not obey the king's order, but the precepts of the law given by Moses to our ancestors. And you, who have devised such tortures against the Hebrews, shall not escape the hands of God. Know that we perish because of our sins. Our living God punishes and corrects us for a short time because He is angry with us, but He shall again be reconciled with His servants. And you, the most wretched and impious man, do not be proud or be carried away by your vain hopes. Do not raise your hand against the children of heaven, for you have not yet escaped the judgment of the Almighty God, who sees everything. Our brothers suffered a short time for the sake of eternal life and have already entered into the friendship of God. But you, for your part, shall suffer the punishment you deserve for your arrogance. With my brothers, I give up my body and my soul for the loss of my fathers, calling on God that He may at once have pity on our race, and that by trials and afflictions you may come to confess that He is the only God. Through me and my brothers, may the wrath of the Almighty, which has justly fallen on the whole of our race, come to an end. The king was even more infuriated at him than at the others because of his mockery, and he dealt more cruelly with him. So the youngest also died undefiled, putting his whole trust in God. After all her sons, the mother also died. This is enough to make known what happened regarding the pagan sacrifices and the tortures beyond all imagination. Second Maccabees, chapter 8. Meanwhile, Judas, also called Maccabeus, and his companions would enter secretly into the villages, call their relatives, summon those who had remained faithful to Judaism, and finally they assembled about 6,000 men. They prayed to the Lord to turn His countenance on His people, oppressed on all sides, to take pity on the sanctuary profaned by the impious, to have compassion on the city destroyed and on the point of being leveled, to listen to the cry of the blood reaching out to Him. And they asked that He not forget the unjust killing of innocent children and show His indignation against those who had insulted His name. The Lord's anger turned into compassion, and as soon as Maccabeus had organized his troops, they became invincible against the pagans. Judas generally took advantage of the night for his military campaigns, so he attacked them by surprise, set cities and villages on fire, captured strategic positions, and put to flight many of the enemies. And people everywhere talked about him and his bravery. When Philip saw that Judas was making progress little by little, and his victories increased from day to day. He wrote to Ptolemy, the military commissioner of Caesarea and Phoenicia, to come and help him under the king's service. Ptolemy at once appointed Nicanor, son of Patrocius, one of the king's first friends, and sent him at the head of some 20,000 men coming from all nations, with the order to wipe out all the Jews. At his side, he put Gorgias, a general of much experience in matters of war. Nicanor intended to raise 2,000 talents by the sale of Jewish slaves in order to pay for the tribute the king owed to the Romans. So he extended an invitation to all the coastal cities to come and buy slaves for a talent, without any regard for the punishment of the Almighty that might come upon him. When Judas learned that Nicanor had come with a great army, he told his men about this. So the cowardly and those who had no confidence in divine justice took to flight. Still others sold everything they owned and asked God to deliver from the impious Nicanor those who had been sold even before any battle. They prayed that if the Lord would not save them because of their own merits, that at least out of consideration for the covenant he made with their ancestors and for that great venerable name with which he had blessed his people, he would do so. Maccabees gathered and reorganized his troops, numbering about 6,000, and exhorted them not to fear the enemy, but to fight bravely against their unjust aggressors, despite their great number. He reminded them how those men had profaned the holy place, slaughtered the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and removed their traditional institutions. He said to them, they come with confidence in their weapons and their boldness, but we trust in the Almighty God, who is able to wipe out in one stroke all who invade our land and even the whole world. He recounted to them all the occasions when God had come to help their ancestors, especially when he wiped out 185,000 men under Sennacherib. He also reminded them of what had happened in Babylonia in the battle against Galatians. On that day, 8,000 Jews fought side by side with 4,000 Macedonians, and as the Macedonians were hard-pressed, their Jewish allies alone killed 20,000 of the enemy's troops with heaven's help and seized a great booty. Judas encouraged them with these words and made them ready to die for their loss and country. Then he divided the army into 4 groups. He assigned his brothers Simon, Joseph, and Jonathan to each lead one division with 1,500 men each. He ordered that the sacred book be read, and he gave them their watchword, help from God. Then he himself led the first battalion and fell on Nicanor. With the help of the Almighty, they slaughtered 9,000 enemies, wounded and crippled many, and put the rest to flight. They seized the money of those who had come to buy the Jews and pursued them for a good while. But it was nearly evening, so they had to return because it was the vigil of the Sabbath. That is why they stopped pursuing their enemies. They gathered the weapons and the plunder of their enemies and celebrated the Sabbath on that day with praise and thanksgiving to God, who had just saved them and had begun to show them His mercy. After the Sabbath, They divided part of the booty among those who had been tortured, the widows and the orphans, and they divided the rest among themselves and their men. Having done this, they asked the merciful Lord during a public prayer to be fully reconciled with his servants. Then, in an encounter with the army of Timotheus and Bacchides, they killed more than 20,000 men and took control of the fortified cities. They divided the abundant plunder into equal shares among themselves, those who had been tortured, the orphans, the widows, and the aged. They carefully stored in safe places the weapons they had taken from the enemies and brought the rest of the booty to Jerusalem. They killed the chief guard of Timotheus, an extremely wretched man who had done so much evil against the Jews. Then, as they celebrated their victory in Jerusalem, they burned alive those who had burned the temple gates, including Callisthenes, who had taken refuge in one small house. So these men paid the price deserved for their impiety. The thrice as wretched Nicanor, who had brought thousands of merchants to buy the Jews, found himself humbled with God's help by those same men he had despised before. Having discarded his splendid robe, he fled across the country as a fugitive and reached Antioch, very much relieved that he had not perished with his army. He who had intended to pay the tribute owed to the Romans by selling the Jews now affirmed that the Jews were invincible and invulnerable, and that someone fought for them, provided they were obeying the laws prescribed by him. 2 Maccabees chapter 9. By that time, Antiochus had to return without glory from the regions of Persia. When he entered a city called Persepolis and tried to plunder the temple and seize the city, its inhabitants rebelled and took up arms against him. These people threw Antiochus and his men out. They fled and returned very much humiliated. When Antiochus came to Ecbatana, he was informed of what had happened to the two generals, Nicanor and Timotheus, in Israel. He was infuriated and determined to take revenge on the Jews for the offense he had just received in Persepolis when they forced him to flee. He ordered the chariot driver to hurry up and not to stop until the journey's end. But the judgment of God was coming upon him, for he said in his pride, "As soon as I arrive in Jerusalem, I shall turn it into a cemetery of the Jews." Then the Lord who sees all, God of Israel, punished him with an incurable sickness of internal nature. He had barely finished speaking when he felt an unbearable pain in his stomach and began to be afflicted all over his body. This was indeed just for one who had tortured others in the same way with countless new punishments. But this did not diminish his arrogance. In his rage against the Jews, he gave orders to journey ahead with even more speed. Yet, because his chariot was running very fast, Antiochus fell and his physical condition worsened. Not long before, in his conceit and sense of superiority, he thought of giving orders to the sea and measuring the heights of the mountains. Now he lay down and had to be brought on a stretcher, giving to all a clear testimony of the power of God. Worms began to teem in the body of the impious, and though he was still alive, his flesh tore off into pieces, leaving him in agonizing pain. The stench of his decay was so intolerable that his whole army shunned him. No one went near him who not long before thought he could touch the stars of heaven with his hand. Only when he was beaten by the divine scourge did he begin to shed his arrogance. His pains grew worse, and he realized this was the punishment of God. He himself could no longer endure his stench. He said, "It is right to submit to God. Mortals should not try to be equal with him." And the wretch made a vow to the Lord, who would no longer take pity on him. He had marched to Jerusalem to level it and turn it into a cemetery. But now he even promised to declare it a free city. Moreover, he who before had refused burial to the Jews and wished to throw them with their children to the wild beasts, now offered to make them equal with the Athenians. He had plundered the temple and profaned the sacred place, but now he promised to decorate it lavishly, to return a great number of the sacred vessels, and to pay for all the expenses of the sacrifices. And he promised to become a Jew and to proclaim in all the inhabited countries the power of God. His pains, however, did not diminish, for the just judgment of God had come upon him. He lost hope of recovery and wrote to the Jews this letter of supplication. To the honorable Jews, our citizens, good health, prosperity, and all good things from the king and general Antiochus. If you and your children are well and your wishes are fulfilled, we give thanks to heaven, for we remember your token of affection and kindness. On my return from Persia, I became gravely ill, and because of this, I thought it necessary to be concerned for the common security of all of you. I do not despair of my condition, and even have great hope of recovering from this illness. But I thought of how my father would designate his successor whenever he set out for any military expedition into the uplands, so that his subjects would not be upset if anything unexpected should happen or any misfortune should befall him. Everyone would know who is in power. I am aware that the kings of all the neighboring countries around are watching the turn of events and waiting for an opportune time. Therefore, I have designated my son Antiochus as king. I already presented and commended him to most of you when I set out for the northern regions, and now I communicate to him this letter I am sending you. I ask you then to take into account the favors each and every one of you has received from me, and maintain the same kindness toward me and my son. I am sure that following my own policies of moderation and humanity, he shall live in good accord with you. In this way, the blasphemer and murderer ended, suffering the terrible torments he had inflicted on others. He died miserably in the mountains of a foreign land. His companion Philip brought his body and then withdrew to Egypt to the court of Ptolemy Philometor, because he feared the son of Antiochus. 2 Maccabees, chapter 10. With God's help, Maccabees and his men seized the temple and the city. They destroyed the altars built by the foreigners in the public squares, as well as the sacred enclosures. After purifying the temple, they built a new altar. They kindled a fire from flint, and for the first time in 2 years offered sacrifices. Once again, there were incense, lamps, and the bread of presence. Having done all this, they threw themselves flat on the ground and asked the Lord not to send them such calamities anymore. But if they should sin again, they asked that He would correct them with gentleness and not hand them over again into the hands of blasphemous and ferocious foreigners. The purification of the temple took place on the same date on which the foreigners had profaned it, that is, on the 25th of the month of Kislev. For 8 days they celebrated the feast with rejoicing, in the same way that they celebrated the Feast of the Tabernacles, remembering how, not long before on that same date, they were dwelling in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Then, carrying leafy branches and palms, they chanted hymns to Him who had brought the cleansing of His own holy place to a happy end. They also decided by public vote that this event would be commemorated annually by the whole Jewish nation. This is all that refers to the death of Antiochus, called Epiphanes. We shall now proceed to narrate the events that happened under Antiochus Eupator, son of the impious, and to relate briefly the calamities brought about by the war. In fact, once he inherited the kingdom, he appointed Lysias to be in charge of his affairs and to act as High Commissioner for Syria and Phoenicia. Now Ptolemy, called Macron, was the first governor to do justice to the Jews. He was upset by injustice done against them, so he tried to solve all their problems satisfactorily. But the friends of King Eupator made use of this to accuse him before the king. They continually called him a traitor, reminding him that he had once abandoned the land of Cyprus, which had been entrusted to him by Philometor, in order to go over to Antiochus Epiphanes. Since he could not discharge his high office with dignity, he was driven to despair and committed suicide by poisoning himself. It was then that Gorgias was appointed military commissioner of those regions and began to stir up war against the Jews by any means. On the other hand, the Idumeans had strong fortresses and harassed the Jews. Gathering the fugitives from Jerusalem, they managed to prolong the war. The men of Maccabees, after praying and asking the Lord to come and fight at their side, attacked the fortresses of the Idumeans. They carried on with their assaults, and the place fell into their power. They repelled those who fought on the ramparts, slaughtered all who fell into their hands, and killed more than 20,000 men. At least 9,000 men took refuge in the 2 towers that were strongly fortified with everything they needed to withstand a prolonged siege. Maccabeus left Simon, Joseph, and also Zacchaeus and his men in sufficient numbers to sustain the siege, and went off to where his presence was more needed. Yet the men of Simon were tempted by greed and let themselves be bought with the silver of those in the towers. So in exchange for 60,000 pieces of silver, they allowed a number of them to escape. As soon as Maccabeus learned this, he assembled the leaders of the people and accused those men of having sold their brothers for money by letting their enemies escape. He condemned them to death as traitors and proceeded at once to capture the towers. He killed more than 20,000 men in those 2 towers, successfully bringing to an end the undertaking they had begun. Timothy, who had been defeated before by the Jews, gathered together an enormous number of foreign troops and a great number of horses from Asia. He appeared in Judea in order to conquer it by force of arms. Before his attack, the men of Maccabeus sprinkled dust on their heads and put on sackcloth as a means of entreating God. They bowed at the foot of the altar and asked God to treat them well and to be the enemy of their enemies, the adversary of their adversaries, as written in the law. After praying, they armed themselves and advanced from the city. They stopped when they came close to the enemy. Right at daybreak, they attacked from both sides. One side placed their confidence in their Lord as the pledge of success and victory, besides their bravery, while the others were moved by hatred. When the battle was at its height, there appeared from heaven before the enemies 5 radiant men riding on horses with golden bridles, who put themselves at the head of the Jews. They surrounded Maccabeus and defended him with their weapons, making him invulnerable. At the same time, they rained arrows and thunderbolts on the enemy, who in turn fell and were dispersed in great disorder, blinded and confused. 20,500 infantrymen and 600 horsemen died. Timothy took refuge in a heavily guarded fortress called Geser, where Chereas was in command. The forces of Maccabeus gallantly besieged the fortress for 4 days. Those within were confident in the strength of the fortress, so they hurled insults and curses at the Jews. At daybreak on the 5th day, 20 young men from the troops of Maccabeus, enraged by the blasphemies they had been hearing, bravely stormed the wall and with brutal fury killed everyone who stood before them. Others took advantage of this diversion to climb the walls and set fire to the towers. They made bonfires and burned the blasphemers alive. Others destroyed the gates, while the rest of the army entered to occupy the city. They killed Timothy, who had hidden in a well, and his brother Chereas and Apollophanes. When all this was over, they chanted hymns and praises to the Lord, who had exalted Israel and had given them victory.